Hello and welcome back to exercise number 1, building a simple grid with CSS Grid. In this exercise, we're going to be talking about a few different CSS properties. First, we're going to use display grid to set up our grid. We're going to use grid template columns to create the columns for our grid. We're going to learn about the new FR unit in CSS, and we're going to use grid gap to create nice spacing in between our grid. So let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at the finished product we're going to be working toward. And as always on these exercises, you can go and cheat and look at finish.html inside the folder to find the CSS that we're looking at today. But we're going to begin in start.html. And it looks something like this. Not quite a grid yet. All these elements are display block currently, and you can see they're taking up the full width of the column. So let's take a look at the HTML behind this. Not a whole lot happening. We have the base styles here, which is just creating the stylistic elements on the page, doing nothing for our layout. And then coming down, we've got a block here for our exercise details. Nothing we need to worry about there. And then if you look here, we have a article grid containing div. This is actually going to be what we apply our grid styles to. And then inside of that, we have, I believe, 8 articles as children, direct descendants of the grid. Grid only works on the direct descendants of the parent item. Now we're going to scroll down to the bottom and we're going to get into, we're in finish.html. Let's not be in there. Let's scroll down to the bottom of start.html and you'll see we have 2 empty CSS selectors. We have article grid, which was our parent, and each article. We're not actually going to apply any styles in the article selector. Grid happens for the most part mostly on the parent element. So we're going to come in here and we're going to go ahead and use the new display value of grid to set this as a grid context item. I save that in, and as we reload this page, you can see not a whole lot has changed. Some extra margins have happened. We lost the margin in between each article because we haven't set that up on the grid itself. But beyond that, everything's still full width, and that's because we haven't defined any properties for the grid and how that's going to work. So the first thing we want to do is set up the columns we want our grid to take up. We're going to use that. We're going to do that with a new property called grid template columns. And that's going to take any number of values separated by spaces. These values can be pixels, percentages, rems, ems, anything you want them to be. Any CSS value will fit in here. To begin with, I'm going to just show you 300 pixel wide columns and show you exactly what CSS Grid does for that. So we have 3 300 pixel columns. And when we come back and refresh our page over here, you can see all of our article cards now fit inside of 300 pixels. And we have all this extra white space over here because grid does not allow for any extra spacing. It's going to automatically flow our content only into 3 columns at this time. So this is a 3-column grid, but it's not exactly what I promised you with a fluid grid. So we're going to go ahead and go back into our code, and instead of using firm pixel values, we're going to change these over to percentage values. So I'm going to make each of these 33% columns. We'll come back over, refresh the page, and you can see now we have 3 1/3 width columns. Now this doesn't account for the decimal places in our percentages, right? So we don't have exactly thirds, and so you can see we have extra white space on the right-hand side that we don't have on the left. And the way we're going to take care of this is actually with that new unit I mentioned in the intro, the FR unit. In CSS Grid, the FR unit represents a fractional unit of the white space available. So in this case, the white space available is going to be in thirds if we specify 1 FR for each of these spaces. 1 FR space 1 FR space 1 FR. So I save that in, refresh the page, and now you can see that extra white space on the right is gone. This is automatically splitting this up into thirds. And you know what? If we wanted this to be in quarters instead, we could add a 4th column over to the right-hand side of 1 FR. Save that in. Now we have 4 equally spaced columns as well. We're going to go ahead and keep it at a 3-column grid for now. And you can see in our example, we don't have any spacing in between our columns or our rows. We could accomplish this with margin like we would have in old CSS layout. You float things to the left and you add margin on the right, and then every third element you go ahead and clear that margin. You remove that margin on the right hand side. Grid clears all of this up for us and allows us to have spacing internal to our grid and not around the grid itself. And it does that with a property called grid, column, or row gap. And so in this case, we're going to specify 1 rem for the grid column gap. And you can see that adds spacing in between each column. And grid row gap of 1 rem. Save that in. And you can see now we have 1 rem vertical and horizontal. Now, this is a lot of properties to add, and it introduces a lot of places for us to typo. So instead of using grid column gap and grid row gap, we can just use the grid gap shorthand, grid dash gap, and specify one value that will take effect for both. So now we take a look, nothing has changed, and just to prove that it does work and we're not having a rendering issue, we'll change that to 1.5 rem. Go ahead and save that in, and you can see it is now 1.5 rem in between all of the spaces. This CSS property does take any value you want it to for your gap. So if we want this to be 20 pixels instead of 1 rem, go ahead and save that in. If we want it to be 2 VW, we can go ahead and save that in, and you can see it shrinks with the screen width. So this is creating a simple, fluid grid that's always going to be 1/3 by 1/3 by 1/3. Now, if we want this to work in different screen sizes, we would still need to theoretically go in and set up media queries. So we could say media query max width 768 and change this for our tablet size. We could say article grid template columns, and specify instead of 3 columns, we can specify 2 1FR columns. Come here. Nothing changes at the desktop size, but you can see as we get to tablet size of that 768 pixel wide screen, we now have 2 columns. But as we keep getting down towards mobile, this gets awkwardly spaced again. So we'd have to come in and change our media query again. So max width, this case, let's do, 480 pixels. And we're gonna go ahead and just copy and paste because we're lazy developers that wanna do things the easy way, and instead we could just have this be 1FR. So now we go back and refresh the page, and now you can see we have a fluid grid that at various breakpoints breaks into different columns, all with 1 line of CSS per breakpoint. Now there's going to be a much easier way, and we're going to handle that in exercise 2, but in the meantime I want you to go ahead and start playing with the values that you can use inside of these 2 new spacing elements, the grid template columns and grid gap. You can even specify that middle column to be a hard pixel value of 50 pixels and get real crazy in here and see something that looks pretty ridiculous going down the page. So go ahead and get in there, play with these values, and I'll see you in exercise 2.